I do appreciate, and I say again, I really do appreciate everybody being here and staying here. 3 hours is a pretty solid effort on your parts, and greatly appreciated on my end as well. This session here serves probably as its main purpose to give you the ability to solve all the fights that we started with sessions 1 and 2. So when you go home and helping your husband or your wife know how they are doing with those things we talked about, and that creates additional discussion, if you will, then hopefully this will give you some of the tools that you need as we think about it. This particular session is called War and Peace, Conflict Resolution. When you think about marriage, I don't know if you remember the Beatles song, how many people are fans of the Beatles or old enough to remember those lyrics. But they had a song that these were the lyrics to. Life is very short, and there's no time for fussing and fighting, my friend. Run the risk of knowing that our love may soon be gone. You can get it wrong and still think that it's all right. Think of what I'm saying. We can work it out and get it straight or say goodnight. I don't know if you remember those lyrics or not, but those are pretty poignant lyrics, actually, as you think about relationships. And as we talk about the whole idea of conflict resolution in marriage. It would be great, maybe it actually wouldn't, but sometimes we think it would be great if there was no conflict in marriage. If everything just went like roses, but we wouldn't grow and we wouldn't benefit from that. I've got a good friend when he was getting married before I was, and we had a common friend who's now a preacher also. And we were down at Florida College at that time, and into the second year for him, and he was getting married right shortly thereafter. And our friend said, I'm going to pray for you in your upcoming marriage. And typical of my good friend, he said, what are you going to pray? So if you ever told him you're going to pray for him, he wanted to know, what are you going to pray? And our common friend said to him, I'm going to pray that you and your wife, he named her, but I'm going to pray that you and your wife have sufficient trouble in your marriage that you can grow stronger. And I'm telling you, I was a new Christian at that time. My first thought was, I hope he's not around to pray for me whenever I get married. How do you pray for your friend that they have sufficient trouble in their marriage? But he understood the concept of what James said when he talks about trials actually accomplish something. Trials aren't fun. He's not saying count it all joy like, man, this is great, isn't it? Look at this wonderful trial we're having. He was saying count it all joy because of what it produces. It does something for you. The trial sometimes feels almost unbearable, but we grow in that process when we endure, he says. And in marriage, it's important to grasp that concept because conflict is inevitable in marriage. It is inevitable. Why? Because you have two sinful people who are joined together. And sinful people will wound each other. You can count on that. I will say things, I will do things that hurt my wife. Generally not intentionally, but I would tell you in marriage, sometimes even intentionally. We will say something because we will be aggravated enough, or we will do something because we'll be aggravated enough. But there will be things that require us to figure out how we're going to resolve the issue at hand. And it can be very simple things. Maybe you bought the wrong kind of gift for your spouse and wasn't appreciated. I would encourage you, if you've never seen a video called In the Doghouse, it was put out by J.C. Penney years ago. And it's about a guy that buys his wife, the whole thing is a commercial, but it's too long for a TV commercial. It's about 9 minutes. But it's a guy that bought his wife for their anniversary a vacuum cleaner. And it was a dual bag, he said. So, he got her the best vacuum cleaner for their anniversary. Well, he immediately in the video gets taken outside by his wife, pushed into the doghouse, literally the doghouse, and he falls through the ground, and he ends up in a place where there are other men who have made similar mistakes. They're eating quiche every night, folding laundry, drinking lattes. He said, it's just a miserable life for men because he bought the wrong gift. You need to watch that video. It's long and enjoyable to understand. It has a purpose, obviously, for JCPenney as an ad. But we do that. I like the guy who said, the woman who said that her husband bought her a mood ring for her birthday. And she said, so when I'm in a good mood, it turns green. When I'm in a bad mood, it leaves a red mark on his forehead. Sometimes, honestly, it can be something that is simple as a bad gift, just a wrong choice, making a wrong decision. Sometimes it could be something said. Sometimes it could be something neglected to be said. It could be missing an event that was very important to your spouse. There's so many things. And obviously, all the way to the extreme where there can be betrayal, even infidelity in marriage. So I'm saying there are lots of things that can create conflict of all kinds of different levels. And so what I want us to think about, so how is it that we're going to solve that? How are we going to solve the conflict in our relationships in marriage? Because we need to solve them. If conflict remains unsolved, then relationships will always go downhill. And so what do you think most couples argue about? What causes most arguments, do you think, amongst married couples? Somebody tell me, just name anything you think is one of those. Money. Absolutely, money is one of those. Give me another one. Children. Absolutely. And different things about the children. How to discipline them, where they can go, where they can't, all kinds of things. Even before. How many are we going to have? How close do we want them together? Children in a marriage create conflict as well. Other things. I'm sorry, what? Absolutely, in-laws. Shows up regularly. I like the guy who said, I finally understand completely the concept of mixed emotions. He said, that's when you see your mother-in-law drive over the edge of the cliff in your new car. So, hopefully we haven't gotten quite to that level. In-laws, what else? How your time is spent? Yeah, good one. Good one. Oh, we're just forgetting one entirely that we know causes conflict in marriage. The physical relationship. That's always near the top of the list, if not at the top. Top 5 show up this way almost every time they're surveyed. Not in this order exactly. The top 3 that you see there are almost always the top 3, even though they change orders when different polls, different surveys are taken. But they almost always show up as the top 3. Finances, kids, and the physical intimacy in marriage. In-laws shows up around 4th or 5th most of the time, and then they start to group. They just say tremendous trifles. In other words, couples argue over the most inane things. Have you ever had an argument that you think afterwards, are you kidding me? Why would we even argue about that? Why would we let that disturb the peace between us when it doesn't mean anything at all in the broad spectrum of things? They aren't life-changing things. Things such as, those who are old enough to remember, one of the things that used to cause many arguments, apparently, between couples was whether you squeezed the toothpaste tube from the bottom or the middle. That was back in the days when they weren't plastic and they didn't come out so that they always emptied themselves. If you didn't squeeze from the bottom, then you had to keep working toothpaste. You remember those tubes, older people? Remember those tubes of toothpaste? And people would argue over that. Tremendous trifles. I would tell you, many arguments in marriage show up in that category. More couples, even though the most common big arguments come through the finances, kids, and the physical intimacy, the most quantity of arguments probably fall even in the tremendous trifles. Things that should be easily solvable if a couple will take the right approach, the right attitude toward those things. So, how do we do that? How are we going to accomplish that? Here's where you start. There's a book written called Fighting Fair, or maybe it's Fight Fair. Tim and Joy Downs wrote the book. This is the first time I'd ever seen this statement, where they said conflict can be viewed as a game. Don't know about you. I'm one of the ones who, when I first saw that, I thought, I don't think I want to play. Thanks for the offer, but I think I'm okay. Let me sit this one out. That's not what he's saying. He's not saying it's a game like it's fun. He's saying, but if you view conflict like a game, there are some things about games that will help us understand the nature of conflict. And we may be able to solve conflict easier if we approach it with the right mindset here. And so there are things like every game has rules. Anybody ever heard of the Marquess of Queensberry? Anybody? What's that? Robert's Rules of Order? The Marquess of Queensberry is the one that developed rules for boxing. Now, I know some people watch boxing and still think it doesn't look like there's any rules at all. But you realize back in the day, before the rules for boxing, you could bite, you could pinch, you could kick, you could do whatever you wanted to do. And finally somebody said, we got to establish some rules here. And so they did. They had rules. We understand that. People play games. You play old-style games like maybe Monopoly. You can't break out of jail. You know, you're in jail. You can't just say, I'm busting out. No, I didn't roll doubles. I didn't get the right card or anything, but I'm busting out. You know what? I'm going to take your property because I'm bigger than you are. I'm taking your hotels away. There's rules. We understand that. There has to be rules in conflict. There have to be things that we understand are not acceptable. You can't just leave the room and walk away from an argument. I was dealing with a couple recently, a young couple, and I said, how are you doing with conflict now compared to before? Give me an example of how you were doing, because we've been working together for a couple years, and they're doing wonderfully in general. And so the woman said, it was always the same before. We had almost no room in our apartment, so there was nowhere to really go hide. So he would go and sit at a table that was in the courtyard of the park. I'd get in the car and go somewhere. Every time we had an argument, we split. A lot of resolution accomplished that way? No, there has to be rules that say if we're going to solve a conflict, we have to solve it. We have to stay together. We have to find a way to address it. We have to find a way to talk about this. Secondly, every game has an object. And so we need to understand there is an object here. There's something we are trying to accomplish, and that is resolution. It is not victory. I can tell you as a male, victory in conflict seemed to be a logical goal to approach, especially early on, with wife or with anybody else. I wanted to prove my point. I wanted her to come around to my way of thinking. I wanted to, when we were all done, that she would acknowledge that I was the one who was right. And so now we're going to do it the way that I had determined we should do it. Victory is not what you're striving for. Resolution is what you're striving for. Tim Downs in his book says, if victory is the goal, nobody wins. And I would tell you that that's true. Anybody ever hear of a Pyrrhic victory? Somebody tell me who's familiar with Pyrrhic victory, what that's all about. That's a common expression, especially if you're looking at history. Pyrrhic victory. Yes, sir. Absolutely. So it was named after Pyrrhus, who they won the victory and lost nearly everybody in doing so. There's something about that says, you know what? Yeah, we won, but was it worth this? I would tell you that happens in marriage too. Sometimes we fight for the victory, but what we lose in trying to gain the victory isn't even worth the victory if we gain it. That can't be the goal. The goal has to be to come about to resolution. We need to solve whatever the issue is. And so we're going to see there's some things that God would tell us we need to do in order to accomplish that. So how is it that we're going to understand what the rules of conflict are? What is it we're supposed to do? Argue. Now, we're not stopping there. It's not just that's what we're supposed to do, argue. But we are going to argue or discuss or whatever. I don't like to say we're going to fight because fight seems to carry a more severe approach to things. But if you think you're not going to argue, I think you're missing the point. There will be arguments. That doesn't mean they have to be handled improperly. I do premarital counseling with any of the couples that I'm going to do their wedding for. They have to sit through multiple sessions with me where we talk about what they're going to experience in marriage. That's just one of the things I ask of them if I'm going to do the ceremony. And so I was dealing with one couple, and we got to conflict resolution lesson. And they were sitting across from me, and they said, we don't need this lesson. We are madly in love. We just aren't going to argue. I said, trust me, you will. They said, no, you don't understand. We know other couples argue, but I'm telling you, we are so into each other, we are not going to argue. And I said, trust me, you will. And so she started to state a third time, trying to make her point again, and I said, let me just stop you right there because I don't care. We're doing the lesson anyway. So you're not going to avoid the lesson, so let's talk about the lesson rather than what. And I said, but I want you to do me a favor. I want you to call me and be honest enough to call me the first time you have an argument in your marriage, a disagreement where you are now locking horns with each other. They were married just about 2 months when they called me the first time and were amazed, could not believe they were arguing and that they had met this objection that they were having trouble getting past. And I said, I told you that would happen. The reason it will happen is, as we said, we are two sinful people who are married to each other. One of us is going to make a mistake at one time, another at another time. We're both going to make mistakes that are going to offend or cause problems for the other person. So what do? We're going to argue. That's going to happen. I need to accept that. Why do I need to accept that? What's the advantage in accepting the fact that there will be conflict in my marriage? You can prepare for it. That's exactly the point. When you have children, if you expected your toddlers to behave and be as responsible as an adult, then you're in for a world of trouble, are you not? But you know toddlers are going to spill things. They're going to be forgetful. They're going to be irresponsible. They're going to fight with one another. They're going to do things. But if you know that's going to happen, it doesn't mean you accept it, but you know it's going to happen, so you're better prepared to deal with it. And that's the nature of conflict. We have to have an ability to know how to deal with the conflict. So first, argue with the right person. Proverbs chapter 3 says, do not contend with a man without cause, if he has done you no harm. How would that even happen? How would it happen that I could argue with my wife if she's not even the one that I should be arguing with? How does that happen? What's that?
You're upset at something else.
Upset at something else, and I come home on the edge, don't I? Maybe I'm aggravated, and she says something, and I snap, and I'm getting upset at her because whatever the case may be. But she's not really even the source of my problem. Don't contend with somebody if they're not the source of the problem. Have the kind of relationship that says, I had a really bad day at work. I need to talk to you about that a minute, because if I don't, I'm probably going to react in ways that I shouldn't. You ever been snippy because of something that's happened? Yeah, I've been there. Apparently me and 2 others. Yeah. We've been there before, haven't we? Where, you know what, I'm just snippy. I don't even know why sometimes. You ever been that way? I don't even know why I'm in the mood I'm in, but I'm in the mood I'm in, and so I need to acknowledge that. When I deal with young couples, sometimes I say, here's one of the things you ought to do. When you come home from work, or you come back together for the first time, maybe you both come home from work, whatever the case is, tell your spouse by a number what kind of day it was. I've had some couples that have found that very helpful advice. They come home and they said, I had a 7 today. I had a 7 kind of day out of 10, a 7. And maybe they talk about something that went really well. And their spouse knows that and can support them in that. But they might also come home and say, man, I had a 3 today. Now the spouse knows things didn't go real well at work or wherever, and so maybe I need to approach things a little bit differently. Maybe I need to sit down and tell them, I'm so sorry that your day went that way. What can I do to help? Can we talk about it? Whatever the case may be. But we acknowledge to each other what's going on in our lives so that we don't start the argument with the wrong person. What happens when we do that is we have a tendency to what social scientists call dump. We start dumping things on the spouse. We overreact. That normally happens. If I'm arguing with the person who's not really the source of the problem, my wife may say something, and it could be anything, and I overreact. What do we have for supper tonight, honey? We're having chicken. Are you kidding me? Chicken, I've eaten chicken 300 days in a row. That's not true. But I might overreact to something simple said. That's natural when we're arguing. Speak the truth in love, God tells us, but speak the truth in love to the right person. Make sure you're dealing with the right person. Secondly, argue about the right thing. It's unbelievable how many arguments are about the wrong thing. I'm not even discussing what it is that I really have a problem with. And I'll give you an example of that, because husbands and wives will be frustrated with one aspect of marriage, but they're afraid it's too sensitive and they don't want to address it with their spouse, so they'll bring up something else instead and get aggravated about something else, even though that's not going to solve the problem. I would assume that anybody that preaches would have had this issue before when discussing with somebody. I'm assuming that Greg has gone through this, where you're meeting with someone and you're talking about what they need to do to obey the gospel, and they give you a reason why they're not. And so you work all the way through that, and you solve that entire reason. And then they give you another reason why they're not. And you go through that whole thing, and you solve that, and they give you another reason. What you're finding out is, we're not really at the problem yet. They're throwing out deflections as opposed to dealing with the real issue. They need to make sure that they're dealing with the right thing. Talk to your spouse about what you're truly upset about. If you're upset because you think he is ignoring you, he won't talk to you, he's over-focused on himself, then tell him that's what you think. You have to find a way to get past that. Tell him lovingly, but tell him that. If you're upset because you think she is neglecting you physically and not fulfilling the obligations that you have, then that's what you need to discuss. Don't discuss other topics if the topic is something different. Make sure you tell the person what it is you are really upset about. Why? Why is that critical?
Never going to meet the resolution.
You cannot solve it if you don't at least deal with the right issue. Isn't that correct? Whatever it may be. You're talking about amongst brethren. You're talking about amongst brother to brother, sister to sister, parent to child. You have to address the real subject if you're going to be able to do that. Thirdly, argue at the right time. Every moment of the day is not right for arguing, even for conflict resolution. If you have a household that's dealing with a lot of conflict, you have to have times when there is normalcy in the relationship to ever be able to resolve conflict. And so if I bring up conflict all the time, we never achieve that calmness that is possible. I even do with couples that I deal with, we set up what we call table talks so that they can behave normally at this part of the day, but they have something they need to discuss. They've set aside a specific time to deal with that. We're going to come to the table. We're going to discuss it when we're both calm. We're both non-judgmental. Both people can express completely what they're feeling about it, and it gives them ability to put conflict on the table in such a manner that they have an ability to focus on the conflict and to be able to solve the conflict. We need to understand that. So, give me some times that are bad for arguing. Before dinner, because you're hangry, right? And so if you don't know hangry, that's just hungry and angry at the same time, which only exacerbates both. So, yeah, right before dinner, not a good time to argue. You know when most arguments happen between couples? Or when they start? Most arguments. Lots start at bedtime, which is a terrible time too. Most start within 30 minutes of the two coming back together from work or wherever they have been. Most come because somebody needs to unload something on the other person. Terrible time. You need to make sure that you've got 30 minutes of good time together or an hour of good time together before you bring up conflict, unless it's so serious that it cannot possibly wait. That's not a good time. Other times that are bad. Well, surely no Christians argue on the way to church, do they? You can't even imagine how many couples I've dealt with who talk about the arguments they have in the car on the way to church, which is doubly magnified because most of the time those couples have kids too. Wow. How bad of advice is that? We're going to argue on the way to church and in front of the kids. What kind of message are the kids getting? Yeah, that's a terrible time to argue. And matter of fact, not only on the way, any time that time is limited. You might not be on the way to church, but you might have company coming over in 5 minutes and you unload some kind of bomb on your wife or your husband. Oh, you know what? This aggravates the life out of me when you do this and the doorbell rings. It's like, oh, hang on, they're here. If time is limited, don't try to resolve conflict. Other times. What's that? In public, in front of company and other people. I have to tell you, I was shocked, in disbelief, and I mean literally in disbelief. I thought, she is so misunderstood her life growing up. The first time Judy told me, I never heard my parents fight or argue. I thought, I can understand somebody saying, my parents rarely. She said, I never heard them. I thought, she's lost her mind or her hearing one. But she hadn't. But I grew up in a household where I could honestly say, I never heard anything but fighting. So it was hard for me to imagine no fighting. But you realize what a great trait that is for parents to say, we're not going to fight or argue in front of the kids or in front of other people. You think her parents never had a disagreement? Oh, they had disagreements, but they solved their disagreements when nobody else was around. They solved their disagreements where it wasn't a display for other people. Don't argue in front of company either. And so there's things that we want to accomplish, things that we want to happen in our relationship and conflict resolution, and understand that attitude is absolutely everything. How you approach conflict resolution makes all the difference in the world. You ever try to get two kids to resolve conflict? Our boys we were 3 boys. One of them would hit the other. I know that's probably highly unusual to anybody that has 3 boys. One of the boys would hit the other boy. And so a boy would holler or whatever else, or he might hit back. You come into the room and you say, what happened? So-and-so hit me. And you say, did you hit him? And normally one of our sons would say, yes, I did. I am profoundly sorry. I have no understanding why I would strike out at my brother that way. He's my brother and I love him. I shouldn't have hit him. That kind of thing should never happen. And I am so sorry, and I'm begging for your forgiveness and his forgiveness. Are you kidding me? My kids never said that. Getting kids to resolve conflict, we'd say, you know what, sit on the couch, apologize to one another. What'd they say? I'm sorry. Put your arms around each other. They thought that was an exercise to see whether or not I could squeeze or pinch my brother without being caught. They weren't real big on resolving conflict. Attitude is everything. Do you want to resolve it? How important is your marriage to you? How important is it? God said it's glorifying His name to the world if it's doing what's right. So how important is it to resolve conflict? How important is it to live the life that Christ wants me to live as an individual? Because it points to Him. How important is that? Do I really care what I'm doing or don't I? What's my attitude in approaching that? So I've got to have the right attitude in that. And here's the objects you want. 1, to understand each other better. Proverbs talks about that whole relationship and being able to come to a better relationship with somebody through discussions or arguments that we have, especially in Proverbs 18. And we think about the nature of that. I want to go on a journey with a conflict to at least get me somewhere that's better than where I started. I want to come out on the other end closer to my wife, not farther from my wife. And so we have a better understanding of one another. It is, in fact, to develop intimacy. Not just physical intimacy, intimacy in general, conflict. In Genesis chapter 2, when God talks about marriage, and He lays down those 4 principles of marriage there. A man shall leave his father and mother, hold fast to his wife, principles 1 and 2. Separation, and now this law of pursuit, or this law of permanence. This is the person I'm held to. And so you've got 2 laws to start with. leaving father and mother, holding fast to my spouse. Thirdly, he says the two shall become one flesh. That is the new entity that is formed. That is more than just the physical union. That is two truly becoming one entity, one person, a fulfillment of one another. So in all aspects of life, they develop a oneness that is like the oneness between God and Christ. They are spoken of as being one, and he tells us we need to be one. Same fashion. We become truly directed at the same goal. Doesn't mean we're in agreement on every single thing, but it means we are hand in hand and walking the same direction with the same intent, the same goal all the time. That's the oneness in a marriage. But then fourthly, what's he say? And they were naked and not ashamed. I would tell you that is the law of intimacy. Not physical, though that's a part of it. That is a law that says what you see is what you get. I can't hide anything from you. Clothing manufacturers typically have one goal. What is the goal of clothing manufacturers? Well, to make money, as with any manufacturers probably. Why do they make clothes? You ever hear advertisements that talk about this is slimming? They make things to accentuate or de-accentuate one way or the other. Some make it to reveal. But regardless, clothing is manufactured to produce some view of the physical body. Would you agree with that? Whether it is to make it less noticeable by being slimming or whatever else the case may be, or it is to accentuate because of what they've removed. Whatever the case is, they're wanting you to draw attention. But when there is nakedness, they were naked, Adam and Eve. So when they looked at each other the first time, there was no clothing. There were no fig leaves or clothes made out of skins yet. They were naked. That just means nothing is hidden. Nothing. You see everything there is about me. I would tell you that passage is emotionally directed as much as it is physically. A husband and a wife become one because there is nothing hidden from the other person. There is absolute intimacy in a marriage relationship. And if we have had a discussion about something we're in disagreement about, you know something more about me, and I know something more about you, and we should use that to develop a closer relationship as opposed to create distance, because we'll never be exactly the same. But I can appreciate the things about her that are different than me. She can appreciate the things in me that are different from her. We can draw together even in that relationship as opposed to getting farther apart. That's what causes us in marriage to say, I refuse to stay angry at you. I'm not saying I won't get angry. We are two allies fighting the same foe. I refuse to stay angry. I'm not going to let us grow farther apart. I want us to grow closer together in this relationship. And we do that as we learn more and more about each other. And that's a good thing. That's a good thing. God says we should be truly naked and not ashamed. She should be able to look emotionally into me and me look emotionally into her and know who she is and she know who I am. And sometimes it takes conflict to bring that about. Let me just ask you this. Have you ever done something and your spouse said, I really don't care for that, or I didn't like it when you did such and such, or I like this, and you thought, wow, I never knew that. You ever come to a new revelation in marriage? Never knew. Is it possible you could be married for 30 years and say, wow, I never even knew you felt that way. But now I know something else. And there is more oneness because we have come to a conflict. And all conflict happens because of what? All conflict. What does James say? He tells us what it all comes from. Selfish desires. He said, I tell people, Judy and I have been married for 45 years. That's right? Good, I got it right this time. 46 in May. 45 years, we've never had an argument in 45 years. Now, I'm not done. We've never had an argument that was based on the fact that I was so selfless and she was so selfless that we just couldn't get past that. All I could think about was her, and all she could think about was me, and that just created us to butt heads because we were the two most selfless people you could ever meet. That's never, ever happened. It never will. You're not going to argue over that. But I can tell you, any argument we've ever had has been because one or the other of us has been selfish in some respect. And God is saying, that's what gets destroyed when you solve arguments. You get rid of that selfishness because we know more about each other. And to clean up toxic waste, sometimes you just have to clear things that have happened. You have to be able to get past that point of where something has been a disturbance. And I need to be able, if I'm going to function going forward, I need to get rid of this. And we'll talk about that in just a second. But I need to get rid of toxic waste in the marriage. We have to solve the things that are behind us and put them behind us. That has to be done. Forgiveness of that debt when that's required. Has to be a true forgiveness of that debt, and we've cleared the marriage of that problem. I can't bring that up again because we have cleared it. You remember Jesus, when he was teaching the disciples to pray, said, forgive us as what? As we forgive others who are indebted to us or have sinned against us. Here's the concept in that phrase. That is not a phrase that means as frequently as I forgive others, although that's included. He's not saying, you know what, every time I forgive, make sure I forgive as frequently as God forgives me. That's a part of it. That concept, as, is saying in the same manner. In other words, here's what I'm asking God to do if I ever pray that. God, forgive me as I forgive others. I'm asking God to forgive me in the exact same way I forgive other people. That prayer scare you at all? Because I wish I could say, you know what, I have always been as completely forgiving as my God has, but I know that wouldn't be honest. I have fought with forgiveness. Have you ever fought with forgiveness before? Difficult to grant it to somebody? Yeah, forgiving as God forgives is a tall, tall order. But I need to do that so that we can put it behind us and move forward from that. There are things that you need to do in this relationship as you got these rules. Wait for your turn. Conflict won't work if you're both talking. I can't tell you how frustrating I know that had to have been for Judy on numerous occasions. Because when she's talking, I'm formulating. You ever been there? I'm formulating how I'm going to respond to what she's saying. I'm no longer listening completely. I'm formulating what I'm going to say. Because I already understand the flaws in what she has said, so I need to make sure to point those out as soon as she quits. Or, more likely than not, I'm probably going to interrupt her before she quits. Wait your turn. When we have these table talks, I tell these couples, you need to sit down and be able to express what you feel, and then the other person can just listen to you non-judgmentally. They can express what they feel. Everything's on the table. You have an ability to deal with that, but you have to wait for your turn. What happens is, anytime we're in conflict, our anger is heightened by what we think we hear and how we say what we say. I can't tell you how many times I've dealt with couples, and here's what you get. We had an argument the other day, and he said such and such, to which he says, that's not what I said. And she says, that is what you said. And so here's my method of dealing with that, because that is unsolvable. That is a conflict that is unsolvable in its present state. That's a he said, she said, no other witnesses. She thinks she heard one thing, he thinks he said something else, or vice versa. So I always ask the question, what did you want to say? What did you want him to understand? Or what did you want her to understand? Say that now. Express to her what you want her to understand so he can re-express. And I can ask her, do you understand what he's saying? And she can acknowledge, yes, she does. And they can deal with that because everybody's got the same thing on the table. Because when we get angry, I think they say something that they don't actually say. I'm hearing things that aren't actually happening because I've already got an idea of where the argument is going. You need to wait your turn and just be quiet and practice active listening. Active listening. I was in Toastmasters for several years, which is just a speaking club. But in Toastmasters, one of the things we learned to do is not only speak, we had to speak, we had to do impromptu speeches, prepared speeches, all kinds of things. We had people who were grammarians, who would help you learn to use the language more effectively if you were using the language in the wrong way, saying words the wrong way, or using improper words. That was their whole job as a grammarian, help you perfect your speaking ability. We had the Wizard of Oz, who had a coffee can and would drop marbles in it every time you said, because that shouldn't be in any prepared speech. And so they'd drop, and you think that's going to help. You say, and they drop a marble in the can, and then you say, again, they drop another marble. And that may just repeat itself several times till it finally logs in. But they're just trying to get you to stop saying, when you talk, those kinds of things. But I'll tell you, the thing that they needed to work on me the most on was they teach you to be a listener, active listener. Because you can't be a grammarian if you're not listening to what they say. Can't be the Wizard of Oz if you're not listening to what they say. You can't write an evaluation of their speech, which all of us were required to do, some more complete than others, but everybody had to offer evaluation for whatever speech was given. You have to listen. You have to. Actively listen. Pay attention and focus. There are times when I've tried to convince my wife I can watch TV and listen to her at the same time. She knows that's not true. She knows that's not true, but I'm still, 45 years later, still trying to occasionally convince her, no, I heard what you said, and then hope that she doesn't say, repeat what I said. Active listening means I stop what I'm doing, I give you my attention, I turn it towards you, and I'm going to let you say what it is you need to say, hoping that you will do the same for me after you have expressed it. That is the way we need to listen to one another. And so as we think about that, just understand, every single game has penalties and fouls. Every game. So what are some of the fouls? What are some of the things that will cause you to lose ground when you're discussing with your spouse? Here's just a few of them that I'll put up there, and you can think about those later. Blame. This is all your fault. Think anybody's ever used that expression? Or not even all, this is your fault. You're the one who started this. I had a cartoon in my office for a long time. It was a guy sitting at the desk of his preacher. And the preacher's not saying anything, but the guy that is there says, I'm here to confess my neighbor's sins. I like that concept because that is so easy to do. You realize how easy it is to see the faults in others. Jesus said what? He said, you want to know how easy that is? We have a tendency to try to do what? How did he describe it? In a humorous way, what did Jesus say? We have a tendency when we're looking at somebody else to do what? Yeah, try to remove the speck out of their eye. So imagine, have you ever gotten a little something in your eye? Anything, just a little something? Maybe an eyelash or something like that, or any little something in your eye that's irritating it. Can you imagine if you were at the doctor and the doctor's got this log sticking out of his eye and he's trying to reach down into your eye with tweezers? That's the picture Jesus has given us. You see, you realize how easy it is to find the fault in the other person when our fault is probably greater than theirs to start with. So we need to understand. Don't place blame. Origins. That's the idea. You started this. It doesn't matter when it started. Wasn't it great that Nehemiah, who had never lived in Jerusalem, when they brought him bad news about the city and that the walls were collapsed and everything was going wrong, you remember what Nehemiah did? He wept and he prayed. And what did he end up praying? Do you remember? I and my fathers have sinned, he said. He had never even been there. How could he be to blame? It didn't matter who was to blame. When a couple is in trouble, placing blame and origins isn't the issue. This is where we are. This is not where we want to be. How do we solve this? That's what Nehemiah did. I and my fathers have sinned. I don't care who's to blame. That wasn't even the issue. We're saying, God, help us get out of this. We're in a mess. Help us get out of this. Couples need to have that attitude. It's not about blame. It's not about origins. It's not about the history of things and how you're going to recount all this. This is the same way you always react. So we go back to those history lessons and attribute that kind of behavior. I used to really wrestle with this one, reading from the record. My wife would say something, and I would say something like, nope, that's not what you said. Your exact words were. How helpful do you think that was in conflict? Not very. I can tell you that. And probably, she was probably more correct than I was. Memory is not as good a thing as we think it is, and we hear things improperly sometimes. What did you mean to say? Not defensive. You know how easy it is to get defensive? I told you my kids never really had that discussion that I said they had. You know what they always said? Did you hit your brother? Yes, but defensive immediately. I had a reason for it. There was some cause. We get defensive. We get comparative. We start making comparison between our spouse and somebody else. I was counseling a couple to which she said specifically to her husband, I wish you were more like. There's no help in that. Comparisons will never be helpful. Belittling. Why do you have to act that way? Or attributing motives. You did that because. You know what? You don't know why anybody did anything. You can't judge their hearts. Jesus told us not to judge the motives and hearts of other people. Why? Because we cannot know them. You can judge actions, and he tells us to do that. You can't judge hearts. And so what keeps us in trouble? What keeps us in trouble? You ever think about that? I mean, a lot of things get us in trouble. Blame, origins, history lessons, all those kind of things can get us into trouble. What keeps us there? Absolutely. I got to thinking when I was preparing this lesson, I thought, man, you know how fortunate you all are to be able to be sitting here and sitting at the feet of somebody who has spent as much time learning this subject and counseling couples and helping couples to understand what's wrong and have read so many books so that I could be such an asset to other people. Anybody starting to get sick? Yeah, you know why? Because pride is easily identifiable, and I'm kidding when I say all that. I hope you understand that. Pride's easily identifiable in other people. Pretty hard to identify in ourselves. But it keeps us in trouble. And so I want to finish just by doing this and helping you to think about the relationship that we have. Because pride, we understand. God says pride what? Goes before a fall. Goes before a fall. Things aren't going to go well when you're proud. Or, I'll tell you, when James says, God gives grace to the humble, but what word does he use in regards to the proud? Do you remember? God is opposed. I want you to think about that for a minute, because that word literally means when you have pride, God is no longer here with you, he's in front of you. That's the idea of opposed. You are now face to face with God because of your pride. That's the idea. I'm telling you, that is a scary thought. When Amos said, now prepare to meet your God, he wasn't saying like we sing sometimes, you know what, life may be over, let's prepare to go and be at home with God. Amos was saying, you prepare to meet him in battle. Because if that's who you think you are, you prepare then to meet your God. You're not going to win that one. Opposed to God, man, what a terrible position to be in. Pride has all kinds of problems. It is simply thinking my way is best, my way is going to accomplish the most, I'm central, I may need God, but I'll let him know if I do, that kind of thing. C.S. Lewis said the essential vice, the utmost evil, is pride, rudeness, anger, greed, drunkenness, and all that are mere flea bites in comparison. It was through pride that the devil became the devil, and pride leads to every other vice. It is the complete anti-God state of mind. And I would tell you that is exactly true, and I think that's the point that James is making when he says that God is opposed to the pride. So, how does it work in marriage? Where is it that pride works so much? I would tell you two things. Two things, and the lesson will be yours. Pride makes it difficult to ask for forgiveness. Why do you think that is? Don't think you did anything wrong. I'm going to have to acknowledge fault if I'm going to ask for forgiveness. Would you agree with that? Yeah, I have to acknowledge fault. And that's not always easy to do. That's difficult. We don't think we're wrong. We're going to have to admit failure. We want to win. It may change how I look at myself. It's difficult to ask for forgiveness. And the longer we hold on, the harder it is to admit Because then we're going to have to admit not only are we holding on to the sin, we're also holding on to pride as well. Anybody remember the old movie Love Story? Ally McGraw and Ryan O'Neal. And there's a whole thing going on where she's dying. She's got a disease and she's dying. You remember the famous line from Love Story? What was it? Love means never having to say you're sorry. Anybody remember the movie What's Up, Doc? Ryan O'Neal and Barbara Streisand. Same discussion, nobody dying, but they're on an airplane. And it's done this way intentionally because he had been in the other movie. And the line comes out and says, she does, love means never having to say you're sorry. Ryan O'Neal's character says, that is the dumbest thing I have ever heard. I thought that was such a great line based on the first movie. You know what? That is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Love does not mean never having to say you're sorry. We need to be the kind of people who apologize. And I just want to throw these up there for you real quick because there's some apologies you need to be sorry for. First, the caveat apology. The caveat apology is the one that says, I'm sorry, but. What's the fault of that apology? Yeah, there's no sorrow, really. I'm sorry, but I had a good reason to act the way I did. Isn't that what you're saying? I'm sorry, but. Think about that. Just in general, but statements always have the intent to focus on which half of the statement? The second half. So if I say, you know what? Man, I'm telling you, Brent is a good guy, but, well, people aren't near as interested in me saying Brent's a good guy. They want to hear what's coming next. Is I'm going to tell you some other thing about Brent's life, which I'm not. So don't ask me afterwards, hey, what was the second half of that equation? Yeah, there's no real acknowledgement. Just, I'm sorry. That video I told you about in the doghouse, in the background, you can hear things being played in the background. And I remember one of them just says, apologize without caveat. Those just keep coming over the loudspeaker in this doghouse that this guy is in. Secondly, there's the remorseless apology. Logically, I'll admit you have a point. I'm not really apologizing. I'm going to acknowledge that somehow in here you have a point. There's an expedience apology. It's just the idea of wanting to get past. All right, I'm sorry. Now, can we just watch the game? I'm only apologizing because I want something else that I need to do. There's a premature apology. I'm sorry. Can we just drop the whole thing? I mean, we need to understand. There are apologies that aren't true apologies. Partial or blame apology, which I always love this one. You ever hear anybody say, I'm sorry you're so sensitive? Who are you apologizing for? The other person. How can I apologize for you? I'm sorry you're so sensitive. This clearly wasn't my fault. If you weren't so sensitive, this wouldn't even be an issue. Yeah, it's easy to have that blame or partial apology. The non-responsible. I'm sorry this whole thing happened. I'm not saying I did it. I'm just sorry it happened. I remember a guy who said his mother caught him doing something, and she told him, you need to think about that. And she said, don't let me ever catch you doing that again. To which his response was, I got to tell you, I'm a little sorry you caught me this time. He wasn't sorry for what he did. He was just sorry he got caught. That's the nature of being non-responsible. Trivializing, hey, it's no big deal. I'm sorry. Evasive, let's just not be mad anymore. 3 things that are required for a true apology, and that's these right here. Regret. In other words, you have to realize that you have hurt someone or caused difficulty. I have to feel remorse, regret for the action that I have taken. If I don't feel remorse, Jesus said in the Beatitudes, blessed are those that mourn, not mourn over the loss of a loved one. Everybody does that. He's saying, blessed are those that mourn over sin. That's what he's talking about, I believe, because he says, blessed are you if you're poor in spirit. You have to get the right attitude toward yourself and understand that by the grace of God, you can have salvation, but you are, in fact, a sinner. And then blessed are those who mourn, who acknowledge that and see that in their lives. Do I truly regret when I have said something to my wife that I shouldn't have said? when I've acted in an unbecoming way, when I've turned a cold shoulder? Does that really hurt me? Because 1 Corinthians 13 says love, I can tell you, sometimes you read those columns, you ever read anything that God has in a list and think, hey, I'm doing pretty good, doing pretty good, doing pretty good. Now look what he did. You're reading 1 Corinthians 13, he says, love is not rude. Love is not rude. That means rudeness is sinful. You ever been rude to somebody? Did it bother you? If you're going to apologize, you need to truly regret it, mourn over that. Responsibility. I have to take responsibility for my actions. I'm not blaming them on anybody else. It is just, I am sorry, period. Nothing in addition to that statement. I'm sorry, and then remedy. I have to understand I've got to offer some way to get past this. So here's what an apology may sound like. I'm sorry. I know I hurt your feelings, and I feel badly for that. I have no right to speak to you that way, and you have every right to be angry at me. Let's spend more time in prayer together to help me with my patience so I don't get angry so quickly. That is an apology that has regret, responsibility, and remedy all involved in it. And I would tell you that's how husbands and wives need to treat each other. Here's how I did, or what I did. Here's how I feel about what I did. Here's what I'm going to do about what I did. And I'm offering all of those if I want to get past that. And then finally, pride makes it difficult to grant forgiveness as well. Why? Why do you think it's difficult to grant forgiveness? Oh, so I may impugn their motives. So now I got to apologize. I don't believe that they are absolutely sincere. Other things. Yes. And it's a tough place to be, isn't it? To be able to be there and to be there in the right way, it's tough to grant the forgiveness because I struggle with that. I feel betrayed. You ever feel that the other person owes you something? Something like, if I forgive them and we put this behind us, there doesn't seem to be any, it's not that I want vengeance, but sometimes we want payment in the sense of I need them to truly understand how badly it hurt me. And if I just put this behind us, we may not ever get to really feel that the way I think we should feel it. I had a brother, not my brother, a brother in the scriptures in Luke chapter 15 that had a real problem with the way dad forgave son when he came home, didn't he? Dad threw a big party, put a robe on the kid, ring on his finger, killed the fatted calf. Dad said, it's behind us. That offense was incredible. The offense, when you go back and read that story. The offense was incredible. Dad puts the whole thing behind him. Older brother says, totally unfair. I want him to pay more than that for it. You know what the problem is? You know who pays for forgiveness? The one who grants it. If you're going to grant forgiveness, it will cost you, not the other person, because they can't pay. They caused the offense. God understands that. He granted forgiveness to us, and it cost him, his son, because I couldn't pay. I'm the offender. I couldn't pay. So he had to pay. That's true in granting forgiveness as well. There is pain and there is cost in granting forgiveness. I like what one person wrote. He said, pride is the dandelion of the soul. Its root goes deep. Only a little left behind sprouts again. Its seeds lodge in the tiniest encouraging cracks, and it flourishes in good soil. The danger of pride is that it feeds on goodness. The solution is humility. The only way to get humility is a servant's attitude and get a better picture of me compared to God, not compared to my spouse or anybody else. So that I'm like Isaiah. When he saw God for who God was in Isaiah 6, he understood who he was in the sight of God, this man of unclean lips. And then he understood how grateful he should be that God was willing to forgive him. That's the relationship we should have as husbands and wives as well. I appreciate so much your attention today. Certainly willing to answer any questions at any time when we're done, if you want to do that. We don't know. I've had a couple of people say, do you still do marriage retreats? We're looking at doing either one or two this year. So if you'll give me contact information, I'll make sure you get information on that as well. If that actually comes to fruition, love to have any couples come where we get a bunch of couples that just spend a weekend together trying to get the tools to make our marriages better and stronger in the sight of God. And I'd leave you with one thing. There was a football coach years ago who was asked, "What's the best team you ever coached?" He said, "I can't answer that question." He'd coached a lot of good teams, but he said, "I can't answer that question." He was a college coach. He said, "If you will tell me where all the boys were or are 10 years after I coached them, I'll tell you what was the best team I ever coached." I loved that answer. He was saying, we're not talking football here. We're talking about people changing lives. And so I get people, they'll ask me when I get back to Bulverde, "Was it a good meeting?" It's like, I don't know. Tell me whether or not marriages are better a year down the road or 5 years down the road. That'll tell you whether it was a good meeting, not whether I presented my part or you were sitting here listening. It's only, did I change in this relationship? Do you change in that relationship? So I would say, you know what? We've still got 3 more lessons tomorrow, but let's make this a good meeting by changing our lives to become the godly men and women that God would have us to be. Tomorrow we get a chance to also talk about parenting.